Welcome back, everybody who's listening. We're continuing our conversation of talking about the consequences of legacy solutions and tech debt and strategic gaps. And today we're going to be chatting about it from an organizational transformational design perspective, which I'm pretty excited about. And to that end, welcome Mark Hill. We're excited to have you here. Mark, I'm going to read this, I always do, is an accomplished transformation and organizational design leader who specializes in guiding organizations to adaptively design their actions for mission-driven success and extraordinary results. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. I guess, maybe a good place to start is just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into transformational design and maybe what that means.
Anytime you create something from nothing, like a company or a new team, you basically have to decide how is that thing going to structure and function, both from an outside perspective, if you're going to kind of look and say, how's it going to structure in a larger business economy? And then, on a micro level, you got to say, how's it going to structure, maybe if it's like a team, within a larger organization? Because none of these companies or teams, rely on themselves to feed themselves, right? They all have to get energy from somewhere, either from the economy or from internal groups they have to work with, right? So those are a lot of really complex dynamics at play. And that's kind of essentially what organizational design is. It's like, how can we design the most frictionless entity that can basically, both, kind of enter the market, that are be high impact, and then internally, as it functions within itself, essentially be high performing. And so those are the two, I guess, dynamics you could say that I look at most of all: how companies are performing externally in relation to their goals, sometimes their peers, if I have enough time to do that kind of research. And then, but also internally with how are they really working with themselves? I'm going to look at the inside of your company, outside in, and I'm going to pretend like I'm a customer and I'm going to see if I'm satisfied. Is what you're like on the inside what you're actually like on the outside? And I said continuity between those two things counts for a lot. That's a frictionless organization that's probably extremely high performing. And, we can look at org design, KPIs, all the rest of the stuff that goes into sort of making that real. But that's pretty much that's the big play on the board. And I'm going to say this about you both is that, I think what you're trying to do and what I'm trying to do aren't very different. You just maybe have slightly different approaches or angles on it, which I find fascinating because this is such a big problem. A lot of angles are definitely warranted. And I think the fact that you're going after, and this is the thing we just called out, and I'm just going to kind of take what Josh said and kind of reiterate it a little bit, is that this is a truly unseen problem. Like right. Your structure is outmoded for your level of competition. Like it can be true, when we think about architecture, like not to get too geeky and technical too fast or whatever, but like when we think about architecture, there's several levels of architecture inside of a company, right? And there's a lot of different ways to define this, but if we're really basic and really simple about it, you've got a business architecture. That's kind of how your business is ultimately designed to be able to function and kind of compete out in the market. Like old school talk would have been like, that's your business model.
I was going to ask for you to define the hidden chasm in your own words, and I think you just did. You're describing what we've been talking about, but you're describing it in a way that I don't think Josh and I really have yet, which is interesting. And I think what you said was when your operating structure is not at the right level is not correct for the level of competition that you're at. Mm-hmm. And that is so apt.
And I think that's one of the really interesting pieces because as you all do, and I do, you sit around and you start to see markers, right? You can go in and you can read a company very specifically. You just ask for a couple of measures. I don't want to see all your dashboards because you're probably looking at too much stuff and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't really tell a story. So you kind of go in and you look for the stories inside of the company. You pull together a series of KPIs on different things that they may or may not be tracking. And those gaps tell you a lot. That's one piece, right? It's like, how's your revenue margin and customer retention working out for you? It's like, you go and you poke like very obvious sort of areas and you see where there are kind of like, giant holes. And then you look and you go look at a different layer. And this is why I talked about the layers inside of the different architecture. Then you go back and you start poking around and you say, oh, that's really interesting. So you're having a customer retention problem. Is that related to pricing? Is that related to customer service? Is that related to, is it a feature issue? Is a feature parity issue or a feature superiority issue? And you go back down and then eventually you can look at that operational layer of, how are all these things actually functioning, against the market and internally themselves. And then the third layer that you go down and you kind of look at, I'm sorry if I'm kind of geeking out on this again too, is that the third layer is really you go back and you look at the performance of the workforce. your workforce model, because you find out, hey, you know what, we're not doing great at customer service, but we've got way too many calls, too high call handle volume for the amount of people that we have. And then we go back and we find the retention rate is like worse than industry average. So like, what do you think is going to happen if it's not easy for your customers to actually use your product, or the way they're trying to use it doesn't really work? Like, these layers all connect, right? So kind of getting that part of it is really, really important, because if you can get that established, and this is one of the most important things you can kind of transform once you get some of that big structure stuff right. If you can get the right telltale signs in the right form to be able to tell really obvious stories into the hands of executives, that gap that I said, that 99% gap where people don't understand the design portion of it, you've basically sort of handed them a playbook to then be able to go back and say, oh, I see. There's a direct relationship between these things. I never looked at that on my dashboard before, right? So it's really finding ways when you get in and you look at, and companies say, hey, go solve this problem for me. Go fix my operating model. We can't get value out the door fast enough. And you come back in and you say, well, you can't retain it fast enough either, right? There's other pieces to this, And until you got gray hair, kind of like you and me and Josh, until you actually have that experience or that system, which I think is what we're both trying to develop, you really can't tell head for tails, right? You just kind of go in and you follow stovepipes around and bang around and hopefully fix a few things. But if you really want to, as a mission, you really want to teach people how to look at their design and where it's faulty and where they really need to scale it up, you need to teach that structure, and you need to teach a lot of those metrics. And I think that's kind of the essence of what might be an early detection system, that we can kind of leave behind with folks.